How exactly did a small, extreme, right-wing party, which could rarely agree with itself on many issues, suddenly become the head of a right-wing coalition? David Broder explores this question in Mussolini's Grandchildren. At first, neo-fascists went about altering history. In the previous episode, we discussed the Foibe massacres, which occurred on the border of Italy in what was then Yugoslavia. Following the war, the remembrance of these massacre sites became an important part of early neo-fascist publicity. They did this to show that there were actually, quote, bad people on both sides of the fighting, unquote, just like there were, quote, good fascists, unquote. They turned the questionable border situation with Yugoslavia into a rallying cry for nationalists all over Italy. This trend continues through today. Somehow, in 2017, Trieste, of all places, was named, quote, the most Italian of all cities, unquote. The atrocities committed against Slavic peoples were quickly brushed aside. This was, quote, ancient history, unquote. But the Foibe massacres were different somehow. Likewise, they shied away from the racist rhetoric of Mussolini's Sallo regime. David Broder says, quote, the fight is not posed in terms of biological racism, but of ideology and culture, unquote. This makes it easier for modern fascists to claim plausible deniability when they are called racist pigs. They omit racist language and instead use their rhetoric to paint themselves as victims. Now, if someone calls you a xenophobic racist, you can reply that you're just, quote, worried about an attack against your homeland, unquote. And that's why you don't want other cultures, races, or religions to infiltrate the country. They claim that the Great Replacement and quote-unquote reverse colonialism are preventing them from flourishing and is hurting their culture. Modern-day Italian fascists claim that they are being persecuted in a way that is similar to how Yugoslavians, quote, persecuted Italians, unquote, during World War II. One contemporary fascist said, quote, today, like yesterday, the worst racism is the ideological racism against Italians. Yesterday it was in favor of Stalin and Tito. Today, against the Italians who ask for controls on immigration and the Islamic threat, unquote. David Broder says contemporary fascists continued this policy of, quote, national victimhood, unquote, with legislation targeting those who questioned the Foibe massacres. They deemed those who denied the Foibe killings to be as blasphemous as those who deny the Holocaust. While Italy recognized the Holocaust and even apologized for its role in it, they still refused to apologize for the hundreds of thousands of Slavic, Somali, Ethiopian, Russian, Ukrainian, and Spanish people the Italian state killed. What makes this more irresponsible is that many of those killed in the Foibe massacres were fascist guards who were found guilty of their crimes prior to their execution. There's no question that ethnic Italians who had nothing to do with fascism were wrongfully targeted by Yugoslavian partisans. But it's generally agreed upon, even by Italian historians, that the Foibe massacres were spontaneous outbursts of violence, which continued because the entire countryside was in a state of anarchy because of Italian fascist rule. On top of this, many of those killed were Slavic fascist collaborators. This immediately disproves the Italian state's historical narrative that the Foibe massacres were a, quote, ethnic cleansing of Italians, unquote. David Broder concludes, quote, the Italian state's position establishes an equivalence between groups, the Italians killed in the Foibe and Jews murdered at Auschwitz, regardless of who they were, why they were killed, and indeed whether or not their political action contributed to their deaths, unquote. One of the most disrespectful parts of this legislation was that it allowed families to be granted medals of valor only if their fallen relatives served in the Italian armed forces. This unsurprisingly barred all former partisans from receiving their medals. This was all done to reinvent Mussolini's regime in a different light. The Salo Republic wasn't a corruption-ridden German puppet state. It was just composed of a, quote, different kind of patriot, unquote. The Slavic and Italian partisans were no longer fighting for freedom. Instead, they fought on a, quote, wave of hate and bloodthirsty fury, unquote. This all helped to radicalize an electorate which was crippled by the 2008 financial crisis. More and more people turned to the far right. In October 2021, the headquarters of the largest trade union in Italy were attacked by violent fascists who were upset that they needed vaccine passes. When anti-fascists gathered in their hundreds of thousands to protest the violent attack, news reporters belittled them. They claimed that the term fascism was being, quote, overused, unquote. One anchor said, quote, if you tell your daughter to come home at 11:30, not midnight, you are a fascist, unquote. Fascists had retained intellectuals in their ranks since the 1990s. Most famously, Renzo Di Felice, a world-renowned historian, released a 7,000-page book on Mussolini, which attempted to offer a more quote-unquote neutral view of the Duce. Somehow, in this 7,000-page book, Di Felice never once mentions the gassing of Ethiopian children, but he sure did manage to recreate a minute-by-minute average day of Mussolini's. Almost 100 years after World War II, the scars of the conflict have yet to heal. Many old wounds are being reopened. In the end, history is not some black and white reality in which people are morally correct just because they say so because they're in power. Alberto S. Sorosa claims the crimes of the fascists and the crimes of the partisans were not in any way comparable. Quote, behind the most honest, good faith, idealistic fighter in a fascist militia were the roundups, the torture chambers, deportations, the Holocaust. Behind the most ignorant, thieving, cutthroat partisan was the struggle for a peaceful and democratic society, unquote. When asked to offer some kind of apology for historical fascism and Italy's role in human suffering, Giorgia Meloni quickly deflects and mentions those who were killed by anti-fascists. There are several modern-day martyrs for quote-unquote post-fascism. The most famous was the death of Sergio Ramelli, who was killed for no reason other than for his far-right politics. Another favorite tactic employed by fascists is claiming that, quote, history itself, unquote, has freed the far-right in Italy. They claimed democracy was being wasted, quote, on one side, unquote. Meloni also claimed a vast conspiracy was afoot. She said, quote, globalists, unquote, were hatching, quote, a plan for the ethnic substitution of Italians and a supposed plan for the ethnic substitution of white Europeans with African and or Muslim peoples, unquote. This will somehow lead to the, quote, extinction of Italians, unquote. This theory is quite unhinged, and again, it's presented without any tangible or systemic evidence supporting the claim. White Europeans aren't being replaced. They just aren't having kids anymore because the world is burning. White politicians and judges are so terrified that this is the case that they are actively trying to employ policy which will force white women to give birth to more children. This thought process has inspired numerous terrorist attacks. In Australia, the shooter who killed 51 people at a mosque cited Luca Traini as one of his inspirations. Traini was a former council member for the Northern League. After hearing about the murder of a teenage Italian girl, he went on a shooting spree targeting African people specifically. Police found him draped in an Italian flag, performing a fascist salute. Meloni drapes her, quote, ideological struggle, unquote, in fantastical terms, regularly calling upon J.R.R. Tolkien's classic fantasy novel, Lord of the Rings, in order to compare the Italian state to Gondor, herself to Lord Faramir, and Europe to the long-lost men of Numenor. Her favorite line is spoken by Lord Faramir when he says, quote, "War must be, while we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all. But I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend, the city of the men of Numenor." Unquote. She said, quote, "Today, like yesterday, the foreigner will not pass." 100 years on, we remember sacrifice by fighting the same battle against fresh invaders. Unquote. In both quotes, she asserts a state of war exists between African and Muslim people and Italy. During the second tirade, she made a point to decry George Soros and his support of migrant NGOs, while also lambasting a plan in Parliament which would naturalize any child born in Italy as an Italian citizen. In one of her most putrid displays of anti-migrant sentiment, she posted a video of an Italian woman being raped by someone who happened to be a migrant and used this poor woman's plight in order to justify her disturbing views. While using high fantasy to justify her low racism, she also uses modern culture and the fact that she is a woman to garner support from a younger audience who otherwise would likely not align with her politics. She uses song lyrics from Maroon 5 in her speeches, promising, quote, "I'll carry these torches for you that you know I'll never drop," unquote. A reference to her party's logo, a burning torch. This torch is claimed to represent, quote, 70 years of the democratic right, unquote, in Italy. However, others postulate the torch is a symbol for the blaze of fascism, specifically the pyre which remains lit around Mussolini's grave. Giorgia Meloni has repeatedly praised Mussolini. Most famously, she said, quote, "Mussolini was a good politician, in that everything he did for Italy," unquote. Today, she has claimed Italian fascism has been, quote, "relegated to the pages of history," unquote. But when she rails against LGBT lobbies, anti-fascists, and anyone else who might disagree with her, I can't help but think she's lying. Once in power, the racist rhetoric of Meloni's far-right Fratelli d'Italia political party translated itself into legislation. Migration policy in Italy has become draconian, to say the least. Italian authorities have mandated the expansion of, quote, "detention facilities," unquote, for thousands of migrants arriving from Western and Northern Africa. Beyond this, they've made it much more difficult for NGOs to operate rescue vessels in the Mediterranean. In several instances, squadrons of the Italian Navy have captured migrant NGO rescue vessels, while also mandating that migrants should be sent to countries who support the same NGOs. If this sounds familiar, it's because the Republican Party in our own country is doing the same exact thing, shipping migrants to Martha's Vineyard on packed buses. Unsurprisingly, members of the far right in Italy glorify republicanism in the United States.